Hey guys, Hop here for TFBTV in my very fancy YouTube influencer studio. Today we're taking a look at 3 different micro red dots. By that I'm referring to red dots for subcompact or slimline handguns. I know the term micro red dot used to apply to an optic the size of an aimpoint T2. Then people started referring to full-size handgun red dots like the Trijicon RMR as micros. Now it's been redefined yet again to refer to the smallest category of handgun red dots. So, the 3 that we're taking a look at today are the Holosun EPS Carry, the SIG-Sauer Romeo Zero Elite, and the Crimson Trace Rad Micro Pro. All 3 of these are either for the Shield RMSC or J-point pattern, or a modified version of it. So, let's start there with the pattern itself. The Trijicon RMR footprint is the most ubiquitous mounting standard for full-size handgun red dots. It includes the Trijicon RMR, the larger Trijicon SRO, as well as all of the full-size red dots from competitors, including the Holosun 407C and 507C. Those optics are not a good fit for the double-stack micro and slimline handguns that everybody's carrying these days, which is where you get into alternatives like the Trijicon RMR CC, which uses a proprietary optics cut. Because it's Trijicon, they can flex that kind of muscle. Very few others can. The much more common mounting standard for pistols of this size is referred to as the J-point or Shield RMSC pattern. Shield RMSC being one of the original optics for this pattern. The J-point cut consists of 2 holes for bolts in the middle, much like almost every red dot standard, and it also has 4 locating pegs, 1 at each corner of the optic. Most of these micro handgun red dots are going to fit that pattern, except for Holosun. They've decided to use a slightly modified version of that, which omits 2 of the pegs and shaves 2 of the pegs down. If you buy a new micro double stack handgun these days, it's probably going to be compatible with the Holosun K cut and not technically the original J-point system. That shouldn't cause any problems as long as you make sure to install that optic properly with enough torque on the bolts. Also, all of the older Shield and J-point optics are going to be forwards compatible with the Holosun K cut, not the other way around. Some manufacturers have come up with a clever way to make their optics cut a little bit more universal. For example, Ruger with the Max 9. Out of the box, the Max 9 is compatible with Holosun K-cut optics. It has the shortened lugs at the front and no lugs at the rear. However, the optics cut is drilled with additional holes at the rear of the optics cut, and the gun comes with 2 little metal pegs that you can drop into the slide, and that gives you your 4 locating tabs for the original J-point or Shield RMSC pattern optics. Technically, you can just leave those pegs out and trust in the strength of the 2 lugs at the front and the 2 bolts holding the optic on, but it's nice to have a little bit of extra security. Alright, let's talk about the optics themselves, starting with the Holosun EPS Carry, because I know this is the one you guys clicked on the video to see. This is a evolved version of the Holosun micro red dots, including the 407K and the 507K. There's kind of 3 big improvements that Holosun has made to this optic. Number 1, most obvious, is that it's an enclosed emitter optic. It has a glass window at the front as well as at the back. So dirt, sweat, snow, rain, whatever, cannot get into the body of the optic and occlude the red dot emitter. That means that you're never going to draw the gun and find that your emitter has either been badly scattered because a piece of dust is on the lens, or your red dot is completely invisible because something is actually physically blocking the emitter. That's a pretty impressive feat of engineering considering that the optic is still exactly the same size as a 407K and still mounts directly. It doesn't have to use an adapter plate like their enclosed optic, the 509T. In addition, unlike the other red dots we're looking at today, as well as most pistol optics in general, the Holosun EPS Carry still has a removable battery tray, so you don't have to dismount the optic in order to change the battery. In order to accomplish that, Holosun did have to use a slightly smaller battery. The original 407K and 507K use a 1632 cell, the same as the other red dots we're taking a look at today, and also the one used by Holosun's full-size red dots that use a tray-loading battery. In order to make the EPS Carry an enclosed red dot in the same footprint as the 407K, Holosun shrunk the battery size down to a 1620 cell. The 1632 already is significantly smaller and has significantly less energy than a 2032 battery, and the 1620 is even less energy still. So we can expect that the battery life of the EPS Carry is probably diminished somewhat compared to the 407K and 507K. Holosun still rates the battery life of the EPS Carry at 50,000 hours. Presumably that's on medium brightness. You should expect to get substantially less than that, but it's still going to be plenty of usable battery life. The EPS Carry also still has automatic shutoff and shake awake like most of the other Holosuns, so should last a very long time. The second big improvement of the EPS Carry over the 407K and 507K is that the glass is much clearer and has less distortion. I assume this is because it's an enclosed emitter optic, very different optical properties, but This optic has much less tint than a 407K, and there's also a lot less edge distortion. The third major improvement over the 407K and 507K is that the body of the EPS Carry is actually even a little bit shorter, which makes it even easier to co-witness irons through the red dot. This one is mounted to a GX4, which does not have co-witness sights, and it doesn't have a very deep optics cut, but I can still co-witness the iron sights through the body of the EPS Carry, whereas with the 407K, I really couldn't. That's not hugely important since almost all of these K-cut or Shield RMSC pattern optics have a built-in rear iron sight notch on the body of the optic itself. Also, it really wouldn't matter if you use something like a Mossberg MC2SC or a Ruger Max 9. Both of those guns have very deep optics cuts and fairly tall sights, so they can co-witness through almost any of these K-cut optics. The EPS Carry is available with a 2 MOA dot or a 6 MOA dot. I had the 407K on this pistol before with a 6 MOA dot, and I never felt like it was lacking in precision, particularly for a very short concealed carry handgun. This one I got in the 2 MOA dot because, to be honest, if you really want a larger dot, you can always just crank the brightness way up, and then the bloom gives you the same effect as having a larger dot. All right, let's move on to our second contender now. Hopefully you won't stop watching even though we've already covered the main event. Next up, the SIG-Sauer Romeo Zero Elite. This one is mounted currently to a SIG 322. The Zero Elite is a slightly product improved version of the Romeo Zero. The Romeo Zero is the optic that you often see paired with a SIG 365 or an XL. The Zero is kind of interesting because it is a polymer body red dot. I know scares a lot of people away, but I haven't exactly seen a lot of reports of them breaking. They also now include a steel shroud, which sits between the body of the optic and the slide and curls over the top of the hood to provide some impact protection. The shroud also serves as a bit of a sealing plate since the base of it sits between the body of the optic and the slide, and the Romeo Zero Elite has a bottom-loading battery. That does mean that if you take it off to replace the battery, you're probably going to lose your Zero. However, this also has extremely long battery life. It has the SIG automatic shut-off and shake-awake features, so it should last a pretty long time. The Romeo Zero Elite also has a circle dot option. You can toggle it on and off, so you can either have the circle dot or just the dot itself. The Romeo Zero Elite is the cheapest, lightest optic we're looking at today, but it does have some definite downsides. For one, adjusting the brightness and the reticle settings is a huge pain in the ass. This does not have externally mounted buttons. It has a single button located underneath the optic's hood. It's really hard to get to. You have to hold it down with your finger or a small tool for a couple of seconds, and then the optic goes into programming mode, and you can tap on the side of the optic in order to cycle up or down in brightness settings. Same thing for the reticle option. You have to hold it down for some unknowable amount of time, and then it goes into reticle selection mode, and you tap it to change from circle dot back to dot. Adjusting the reticle and brightness settings of the Romeo Zero Elite is probably one of the most frustrating experiences of my life, so you're going to just need to set and forget it. Unfortunately, that means you're probably going to have to deliberately choose a very bright red dot setting so that it's never overwhelmed if you're out in bright sunlight or if you're using it in conjunction with a weapon light. Another annoying aspect of the Romeo Zero Elite is that to adjust the zero, you have to use a very small Allen key, and there are no definitive windage or elevation clicks. So you kind of just have to crank it vaguely in one direction, shoot another couple rounds, and hope that you're getting closer to the target and not farther away. That's actually fairly common. I think almost all of the optics for this footprint have that style of adjustment, and the click adjustment on the Holosun is an exception and not the rule. On to number 3, the Crimson Trace Rad Micro Pro. This one is unique among the optics we're looking at today because this is a green red dot. Not a red-green dot or a red-red dot. It is a green dot optic, and it's mounted to a Ruger Max 9, which you might remember from James Reeves' Maraca Heavy review. The Crimson Trace Rad Micro and Rad Micro Pro are also fully automatically controlled. The user cannot make any adjustments. Brightness is controlled by an ambient lighting sensor. On the Rad Micro, the optic is always on as long as there's a battery in it. The Pro has an additional shut-off and shake-awake feature similar to the other optics we're taking a look at. These optics use the proper J-point Shield RMSC pattern, so I have the metal locating tabs installed in the Ruger Max 9 to give it a little bit more added security. I am not a big fan of green dot optics, and the Crimson Trace Rad Micro Pro is not doing anything to change my mind about that. This has a couple of major downsides. Number one, that green dot sucks down battery life. This thing is rated at 7,000 hours of battery life versus 20,000 hours for the red dot. That 7,000 hours of battery life is probably contingent on average lighting conditions, so it could end up being quite a lot less than that. And because this is a bottom-loading battery design, you're going to have to lose that zero every time you replace the battery. That short battery life is also hard to swallow because this optic is just way too dim all the time. No matter what the lighting conditions were, the dot never seemed to get above a certain level of brightness. I made sure to replace the battery, tested the batteries with a multimeter, everything's fine there, it's just the way this dot seems to work. It's possible that the red dot is a little bit brighter, maybe the green one's just relying on that pseudoscience about green dots being easier for your eye to see. That's not really true. It's based on the idea that your eye is more sensitive to green light, but there are so many other factors that go into your ability to see and acquire a red dot sight picture. Not the least of which is the possibility that you might be shooting outdoors in an environment with a lot of green in it, whereas there are very few environments that are naturally red, except for perhaps Mars. This dot was so dim that even in the most ideal of lighting conditions, standing out in the full sun with the light sensor fully illuminated, it was still really hard to follow and track the dot under recoil. It's just hard to see, low contrast, not a very good experience. This red dot also has the same Allen key adjustments as the Romeo Zero, so no tactile clicks to give you an indication of how far you're adjusting it. You just kind of got to fly blind and eventually figure it out. So overall, Crimson Trace Rad Micro Pro, fairly disappointing. The winner of these three optics should be no surprise if you watch this far. It is the Holosun EPS Carry. This is a significant generational upgrade over a whole lot of the older red dot designs. Not just because it has an enclosed emitter, which is a feature that people are becoming way more excited about, and for good reason. It's also got the side-loading battery, which is a major convenience feature, and the overall usage of the red dot is much better. You can adjust the brightness on the fly with the big buttons on the side. Adjusting your zero, you have the benefit of tactile and audible clicks for windage and elevation, so you know exactly how far you're adjusting or how far you need to adjust. You can, if you're really worried about those buttons getting bumped accidentally, put the optic into a lockout mode so it will stay frozen in your chosen brightness settings. Basically, the EPS Carry completely blows these other ones out of the water, and it should, because it's way, way more expensive. Holosun optics are getting so advanced these days that they're basically charging Trijicon prices, as well they should. Nobody else is even bothering to keep up with them on features anymore. If that's too much, there's always the older Holosun 407K, which I think is still better than the other optics we took a look at today, and significantly cheaper. It's not going to give you that enclosed emitter goodness, but in all other respects, it's still very advanced compared to most options on the market. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. TFBTV is supported by our sponsors, Ventura Munitions and Top Gun Supply. We're also supported directly by our viewers via Subscribestar and Utreon. Links to both of those are in the video description. If you join up, you'll be eligible for a lot of cool giveaways, including free belts, free slings, free guns sometimes. So check it out. See you guys next time.